You think being a medieval knight was hard? Try being the man who stood behind him armed with nothing but a 6-foot stick, 100 arrows, and zero glory. Before the swords clashed, before banners flew, before the blood soaked into the earth, there was the longbowman, silent, anonymous, and utterly indispensable. But if you think the life of a medieval archer was just about shooting arrows from afar, think again. It was a brutal job that broke your body, shattered your mind, and erased your name from history. No one remembers the archers. No one sings their songs. But without them, empires would have collapsed. Geoffrey was 8 years old when the king took his childhood. Not literally, of course. But by royal decree, every able-bodied boy in England from age 7 to 60 was legally forced to practice with the longbow every Sunday right after church. Mispractice. Enjoy your fine, or some alone time in the stocks. This wasn't a hobby. It was national survival. At first, the bow was too big for him, nearly as tall as his body, as heavy as the bucket he used to fetch water, but he was told to pull, again, and again, and again, until his small fingers blistered, bled, and then blistered again. Tears weren't met with sympathy. They were met with more reps. Because in this world, if you couldn't pull a bow, you were useless. It wasn't just about hitting targets, it was about building war machines out of children. By the time Geoffrey was 12, his body was already transforming. His left arm thicker than the right, his spine beginning to twist. And his instructors were thrilled. Not because he had potential, but because his skeleton was finally adapting to the burden. The archers of medieval England weren't born. They were forged one agonizing pull at a time. Archaeologists have found the proof skeletons with grotesquely thickened left arms, mangled finger joints, and spinal deformations. These weren't injuries, they were job requirements, and all this was before Geoffrey ever saw a battlefield. So next time you hear about medieval glory, chivalry, and honor, ask yourself this: what kind of kingdom builds its army out of broken boys? And what happens when those boys grow up and realize no one's coming to save them? Geoffrey had always thought pain was something that came from accidents, a scraped knee, a bruised shin, a fall from a tree. That was before the bow, before pain became scheduled, routine, mandatory. He was 10 the first time he touched the weapon that would define and disfigure his life. It wasn't even a full war bow, just a training model. But to a boy barely 4 feet tall, it felt like a medieval torture device. He could barely lift it, let alone pull it. But pull it, he did over and over again until his arms shook and his fingers split open. And no one helped. That was the point. Archery in medieval England was not a sport. It was a state-mandated transformation. Every Sunday, by royal order, every male between 7 and 60 had to gather in the fields to practice longbow drills. This wasn't about recreation, it was about war readiness. Skip it, and you'd face fines or public humiliation in the stocks. The expectation was simple: bend the bow, or break trying. The longbow wasn't just difficult, it was monstrous. The real war bows recovered from medieval battlefields had draw weights of 90 to 180 pounds, depending on the era. That's the same as lifting a full-grown pit bull with just 3 fingers and doing it 200 to 300 times per session. And if you couldn't do it, you weren't dismissed. You were shamed, mocked, pressured, replaced. This wasn't just training, it was a sorting mechanism, a survival filter. The early days were the worst. Geoffrey would come home with hands covered in open sores, muscles trembling from strain, but there were no healers, no rest days, no sympathy. His father, a former archer himself, simply handed him raw animal fat to rub into the wounds, muttering, "The bow doesn't care about blisters. Neither will the enemy." What kind of world trains children to suffer? By the age of 12, Geoffrey had transitioned to a full-size war bow. The thing was nearly 6 feet tall, made of yew wood, so dense it bent only with violent resistance. Each pull wasn't just muscle, it was defiance against gravity, pain, and biology. This was a weapon that warped the human body around itself. Archaeological evidence confirms what Geoffrey and thousands like him lived through. Skeletal remains of medieval archers show enlarged left arms, twisted spines, calcified shoulders, and deformed finger bones. Their very anatomy had been reshaped not by evolution, but by obligation. Let that sink in medieval England, literally restructured children's bones to serve the needs of war. And no one blinked. Even their training schedules were engineered to maximize damage. Mornings began with hauling stones, building the muscle groups needed to draw and hold a bow for hours. Then came resistance drills, pulling a bowstring against a fixed weight dozens of times without firing. By noon, most boys couldn't feel their fingers. By sunset, they couldn't lift their arms. And then they did it again the next day. This wasn't education. It wasn't discipline. It was weaponization. The irony. These boys weren't even guaranteed a future on the battlefield. Many would die of infection disease or accidents before ever firing a shot in war. Their lives were gambled before they even had a chance to choose, and yet the kingdom praised them, called them patriots, heroes in waiting. But is it heroism? When you're never given a choice. By 13, Geoffrey could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute accurately at 200 yards. He had calluses so thick a needle couldn't pierce them. His left arm bulged unnaturally, his back ached constantly, and every night he stared at the ceiling of his wooden shack and wondered, is this all I am now? A machine for killing. There was no applause, no medals, no glory, just the unspoken truth that if you stopped pulling, you stopped mattering. The scary part. This wasn't exceptional. It was normal, expected, celebrated. So when you hear tales of medieval honor longbow heroes and glorious victories, remember the cost. Remember Geoffrey, a boy who didn't choose the bow. The bow chose him, and it never let go. By 16, Geoffrey had the body of a warrior and the soul of a prisoner. He could draw a 100-pound war bow a dozen times a minute. He could shoot accurately at over 200 yards. His left arm had grown grotesquely thick, his shoulders knotted with muscle and scar tissue. But what he couldn't do, what no training had prepared him for, was carry the weight of everything else. Because being a medieval archer didn't stop at shooting. It was a full-time sentence. The longbow itself stood nearly 6 feet tall, weighing just 3 to 5 pounds. That sounds light until you've marched 20 to 30 miles a day through mud, sleet, and frozen rivers with 80 pounds of gear strapped to your body. Then even a wooden stick becomes a burden. And Geoffrey wasn't alone. Thousands of archers moved like a herd of ghosts, half-starved, half-broken, and fully expendable. They didn't travel in silence. They groaned, they limped, they bled. Some joked that they weren't men anymore, just walking weapon racks. But no one was laughing. Their gear was misery disguised as necessity. Along with the longbow came a quiver of 60 to 100 arrows, spare bowstrings wrapped in wax cloth, daggers, rations, cloaks, tools, and if they were lucky, chainmail or a quilted gambeson. Add it all up, and you're carrying more than half your body weight every single day. There were no carts for archers, no horses, just feet and pain. And medieval boots. Thin leather, no padding, zero waterproofing. Geoffrey's toes turned black one winter from frostbite. Another summer, he nearly collapsed from heat stroke. There were no medics, no break days, no sympathy. Just the same command, keep moving, because war waits for no one. But the terrain didn't care. Rain turned roads to rivers. Marches dragged through ankle-deep mud up jagged hills across broken farmland and forest trails that seemed designed by someone who hated feet. Fires were banned in enemy territory. So they slept cold, wet, and afraid, wrapped in damp cloaks, praying the bugs would eat someone else that night. Every day was a gamble between hunger weather and the silent killer exhaustion. Geoffrey stopped feeling his shoulders after the 5th day of marching. His back ached so violently that he began to hunch. His fingertips went numb, and yet he kept walking. Because falling behind meant punishment, or worse, being left. You weren't just fighting the enemy. You were fighting time terrain and your own body. The commanders didn't care. As long as you could draw the bow when it counted, your suffering was just part of the plan. One more cracked soldier in the machine of medieval warfare. And when the battle finally neared, things only got worse. There was no moment of rest before combat, no inspirational speech, no rallying cry, just a signal, a horn blast, a shouted name, and suddenly you were expected to fall into formation, string your bow notch and arrow, and become death incarnate. You could barely stand, but you had to aim. Archers didn't line up in fancy rows. They formed a gentle curve, shoulder to shoulder, hundreds wide. The curve wasn't for style, it was for slaughter. It allowed every volley to converge from multiple angles, turning the battlefield into a kill zone no enemy could escape. But that's only if you still had the strength to pull. Geoffrey's arms trembled as he readied his first shot. His bowstring, though waxed and wrapped in oilskin, felt slick from the rain. His hands, numb and cracked, struggled to grip. Around him the air was tense, silent, the calm before the scream. And then it came. The first wave of arrows cut the sky like lightning. Thousands of shafts launched together, a deafening whoosh, followed by distant screams. Arrows hit shields, flesh helmets, horses. It didn't matter if you were noble or peasant. One arrow in the wrong spot and your name ended there. But the enemy kept coming. That's the part no one tells you. Even a wall of arrows won't stop a determined enemy. Not always. Not forever. Eventually they reach you. And when that happens, the bow becomes a stick. The distance becomes nothing. And you become a target. But Geoffrey kept shooting. Not because he believed in victory. Not because he wanted to be a hero. But because stopping meant being noticed. And being noticed meant dying. He fired, he aimed, he moved, over and over, and all the while he wondered if his arms would just snap off mid-draw. This wasn't a battle. It was survival. One breath at a time. One shot at a time. One moment away from being forgotten. The first thing to die on the battlefield isn't the body. It's the illusion that you'll make it out. When the arrows run out, the myth of the medieval archer collapses. Because suddenly you're not a long-range weapon anymore. You're just meat with a stick. Geoffrey knew it the moment his hand reached back and found nothing. No arrows, just air. 60 shots gone. 15 minutes of hell. And now, the real fight was just beginning. There were no supply trucks, no reinforcements, no second chances. Once your quiver was empty, your options narrowed to one: survive, or be cut down. Enemy infantry poured through the gaps in the line, screaming, armored, furious. They weren't just soldiers. They were executioners with vendettas. And every archer was a walking target. Geoffrey dropped his bow. It had served him well until it became dead weight. In his hand, he gripped the only thing left, a dagger. Just 6 inches of metal against a man in full plate with a 5-foot longsword. This wasn't a duel. It was a death sentence. Around him, archers scrambled, panicked. Some pulled out axes used for chopping wood. Others held hammers, mauls, or clubs, makeshift weapons, for a fight no one trained for. A few desperate men used their longbows as staves, swinging wildly, trying to trip horses or block sword strikes. It rarely worked. Because here's the truth, they never tell you in the stories archers weren't soldiers. They were tools. Tools that shattered when the enemy got too close. Geoffrey saw one of his friends run. The man didn't get 10 feet before a spear pinned him through the gut. Another turned to swing his hammer and got his skull split like firewood. This wasn't battle, it was slaughter. Every knight that reached their line was fueled by rage. After all, they had just spent 15 minutes watching their comrades get turned into pincushions. Now it was payback. And archers weren't wearing steel. At best, they had a padded gambeson. At worst, a leather vest and prayers. No match for a warhorse. No chance against a blade. Geoffrey fought anyway. Not because he wanted to be brave, but because stopping wasn't an option. His dagger caught airwood and once barely a man's thigh. But bravery doesn't deflect a sword. A mace slammed into his ribs. He dropped. Everything went quiet for a second, like the world took a breath. Then the pain hit. Bone deep. Paralytic. He crawled. Not to fight. Not to win. Just to not die in one clean blow. And even that wasn't guaranteed. This is the part that never makes it into the legends. The moment when the trained, obedient elite longbowman becomes a crawling, gasping body on the ground, bleeding into the dirt he once marched across proudly. Because when the arrows are gone and the enemy is face to face, all the training, all the honor, all the glory of war becomes a sick joke. Geoffrey was never taught to scream. But that day he learned. Some archers survived, some escaped. A few killed knights with lucky strikes. But most became stains. Broken, forgotten, unnamed. And even if you lived, even if you crawled off the field half conscious and bleeding, you hadn't really escaped. Because what died that day wasn't just men. It was hope. The truth is simple. Medieval warfare didn't end when the fighting stopped. It ended when you realized the people who trained you to kill never planned to keep you alive. Survival wasn't the end. It was the sentence. Geoffrey lived through the battle. Somehow. His ribs cracked. His shoulder dislocated. One eye swollen shut. But he breathed, and that alone made him one of the lucky ones. But what followed wasn't relief. It wasn't rest. It was the slow unraveling of everything he was. He limped into the field hospital, a generous name for a blood-soaked barn full of dying men stacked like firewood. The air reeked of wine pus, rotting flesh, and resignation. There were no anesthetics, no sterilized tools, just bone saws, hot irons, and men screaming through leather straps. His wounds weren't even considered the worst. So he waited. He watched them cut off a friend's leg with a butcher's knife. Another man's arm was cauterized with a glowing rod, while he thrashed and convulsed. One archer tried to run. He was dragged back and tied down. This wasn't healing. It was damage control. When it was Geoffrey's turn, the surgeon poured wine into his broken side and jammed in a dirty cloth. No stitching. No explanation. Just, you'll either live or you won't. He lived, but he never healed. His right hand, his draw hand, never regained full function. The tendons were too torn, the fingers too stiff, which meant his career as an archer was over, just like that. One blow, one twist, and everything he was gone. There were no disability payments, no pensions, no medals, just silence. He was discharged and sent home with a few coins and a broken bow. The same villages that once trained boys to kill now barely had room for the men who survived. Geoffrey returned to his town a ghost. He couldn't work the fields, his hand was useless. He couldn't return to war, his body was broken. He tried carpentry, failed, tried begging, starved. Eventually he got a job as a night watchman. The same man who once rained death from 200 yards now guarded chickens. That was the reward for loyalty. And he wasn't alone. Former archers littered the countryside, crippled, unwanted, forgotten. Some cut off their own fingers to avoid being conscripted again. Others drank themselves into early graves. A few like Geoffrey just kept existing, dead men who still breathed. The state never honored them. The church, it condemned them. Papal decrees had labeled longbow warfare inhumane, especially when used against fellow Christians. So even salvation was uncertain. The same bow that once made him valuable now made him unworthy. Socially, he was nothing. Not a knight, not a lord, not even a respected craftsman. Just another broken tool from a war no one wanted to talk about. Some people crossed the street when they saw him. Some kids whispered about his twisted hand, the way he winced at loud sounds. And every night when he lay down, he saw the same image, a friend's face, eyeless mouth, open, half buried in the mud. Because the real trauma of war isn't what it does to your body. It's what it leaves behind in your mind. No one taught Geoffrey how to live without war. No one taught him how to sleep without nightmares. He stopped going to church, stopped talking, stopped feeling. He walked the same streets for 20 more years. People forgot his name. But his limp, they remembered that. The final insult. When he died, they buried him in a pauper's grave. No marker, no prayers. The same hands that defended a kingdom couldn't even afford a coffin. And the kingdom, it never looked back. Because when history writes about war, it remembers kings' banners and battles won. It doesn't remember the man who bled out behind the hedgerow, or the archer who died gasping in the mud. It doesn't remember Geoffrey. But now, you do. So ask yourself, was it victory Or was it disposal? Was it glory? Or just sacrifice without a name? And if this is what survival looked like, what exactly were they fighting for? Geoffrey never asked to be remembered, but he deserved to be. His story isn't unique. That's what makes it terrifying. There were thousands like him, boys turned into weapons, men discarded like scrap, not because they failed, but because they succeeded then outlived their usefulness, and now their names are gone, their graves unmarked, their sacrifices swallowed by the same silence that raised them. History doesn't forget because it's cruel. It forgets because it's busy celebrating someone else. We talk about kings but not the men who bled to keep their thrones. We praise victories but not the collateral. We reenact battles but skip the part where the archers screamed in mud as their ribs collapsed. Because it's easier to cheer a sword than to remember a broken hand. And maybe that's why this story matters. Because it breaks the pattern. It forces us to look away from the glory and into the dirt, into the face of the man who trained since childhood only to be crushed by the very machine he kept alive, into the cracked bow, the rusted dagger, the trembling hands, into the life that didn't make it into textbooks. This is what war actually looks like from the ground. And now, you know. You know what it cost to keep a kingdom standing. You know what was done to boys in the name of protection. You know what happened after the arrows stopped flying. So the question isn't whether Geoffrey was a hero. The question is, why did no one remember him? Why did a man who gave everything die in silence while those who ordered his pain got statues? Why are we still choosing what history to remember based on who wore the crown, instead of who carried the weight? And if that makes you angry, unsettled, or just quiet good, because that discomfort, that's your humanity speaking. Now do something with it. Drop his name in the comments. Let him live again. Save this story. Share it. Pass it on. Let the silence end with you. And if you want more truths like this, more stories that didn't make it into the song, subscribe. Not because I said so, but because someone like Geoffrey deserves to be known, not once, but always. Because if we don't tell their stories, no one will, and history will go back to sleep.